When I was too weak to stand, they pressed my hand against the paper. I thought family would protect me, but they saw my sickness as an opportunity. They thought I wouldn't fight back. They were wrong. My name is Clara Henderson. I'm 74 years old, and until last winter, I would have told you that I'd lived a steady, quiet life. I was a school librarian for almost 4 decades, and I carried with me the calm rhythm of books, the order of shelves, and the quiet joy of seeing children find stories that would stay with them forever. After my husband, Henry, passed 10 years ago, I learned to build my days around routine. A morning cup of tea by the window, tending to the flowers he had planted before his heart gave out, and afternoons filled with reading or knitting. Life was not glamorous, but it was mine, and I had earned every ounce of peace. I had been careful with money my whole life. Henry and I never had much, but we managed. He was a machinist, and I stretched every dollar of his paycheck, putting a little aside each month. After his passing, I lived on his pension and my savings. I wasn't wealthy, not by any measure, but I had enough to cover my needs and a little more for emergencies. It gave me comfort, knowing I wouldn't have to depend on anyone. My son, Daniel, and his wife, Marcy, came by now and then. Daniel had been close to his father, but after Henry died, something shifted. He visited less often, and when he did, it was usually Marcy doing most of the talking, about bills, about opportunities, about how hard things are these days. I tried not to read too much into it. Families drift, I told myself. At least they still came. At least I still saw my grandson, Alex, when he wasn't too busy with school. That winter, however, my world cracked open. It started with what I thought was just a bad cold. A cough, fever, chills. But by the third night, I was shaking so badly I couldn't even walk to the kitchen for water. Pneumonia, the doctor said. My lungs were weak, and my age made recovery slower. For 2 weeks, I barely left my bed. The room spun when I tried to sit up, and I relied on Daniel and Marcy to bring groceries, medicine, and sometimes just sit in the living room while I dozed. I should have felt grateful. I told myself again and again, at least they're here, at least I'm not alone. But something about their presence was different. I would wake up and find Daniel rifling through my mail, Marcy whispering on the phone in the hallway. They would hush each other when they noticed me watching. I chalked it up to my fevered mind, fogged with medicine and exhaustion. One evening, I remember Marcy leaning over me with a paper. My hand was limp in hers. "It's just a hospital release form, Clara," she said softly, pressing my finger onto an ink pad, then onto the page. I was too weak to argue. My head sank back into the pillow, and I let them guide me as though I were a child. When I grew stronger, I tried not to dwell on it. Recovery demanded patience, and I clung to my small comforts, the kettle whistling in the kitchen, the scent of lavender from the garden Henry had once tended. But in the quiet moments, unease whispered. Why had they needed my fingerprint? Why hadn't I read the paper? Why did Marcy's smile feel too bright, too rehearsed? I told myself to focus on healing. One step at a time, Clara, I thought. You'll be yourself again soon. Yet in my gut, I knew something had shifted. My sickness had given them a window, and I wasn't sure I'd like what I'd find when the fog finally cleared. When strength finally returned to my bones, I thought the worst was behind me. The pneumonia had eased. My cough was quieting, and I was slowly able to walk down the hallway without holding on to the walls. It felt like victory, until the world reminded me that not every battle ends with the body. Some begin when you least expect it. The first sign came in an envelope, a plain white one with the bank's crest in the corner. I wasn't alarmed at first. I received statements every month. But when I tore it open, the language was strange. "We're pleased to confirm the updated authorizations on your account." Updated authorizations? My eyes skimmed the lines, searching for clarity. The letter thanked me for adding designated representatives to access certain funds. I frowned, reading it twice, my heart beginning to pound. I hadn't authorized anyone. I hadn't even been to the bank in months. My hands trembled as I folded the paper back into its envelope. Perhaps it was a mistake, I told myself. Clerical errors happen. Still, unease crawled through me like cold water dripping down my back. 2 days later, the phone rang. The caller ID displayed the bank's name again. A polite voice asked if I was confirming the recent withdrawal request. My breath caught. Withdrawal? I told them I had made no such request. The clerk's tone shifted quickly, stiff, cautious, as though my answer complicated things. She assured me no action would be taken until I appeared in person to confirm. When I hung up, my knees nearly gave out. The kettle whistled on the stove, but I couldn't bring myself to pour the tea. I sat at the table, staring at my trembling hands. The image of Marcy pressing my finger onto that paper haunted me. The ink pad, the smudge, the way she avoided my eyes. A hospital release form, she had said, but hospitals don't update bank authorizations. That evening, Daniel stopped by. He was unusually cheerful, almost too much so. He carried a box of takeout, insisted I eat more, and kept asking how I was feeling. I wanted to believe his kindness, but my eyes lingered on the way he avoided the mail stacked by the door. At one point, I saw his gaze flick to the envelope from the bank sitting under a magazine, and his smile tightened. "Mum," he said, wiping his mouth with a napkin, "you should let us handle things while you're recovering. Bills, paperwork, all that. You don't need the stress." I nodded weakly, though inside I was screaming. Handle things? Or take them? The son I had raised with bedtime stories and homemade pies now spoke to me as though I were a burden to be managed, not a mother to be respected. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The moonlight stretched across the floorboards, and I lay awake listening to the silence of the house Henry and I had built together. Memories rose unbidden. Daniel, as a boy, clutching my hand on his first day of school, his voice breaking when Henry passed, promising me, "I'll always look after you, Mum." That promise now felt like a cruel joke. The next morning, another letter arrived. This one mentioned loan consideration. My pulse raced as I read. Loan? In my name? It spoke of collateral, my account, my property. My chest tightened. Someone had gone beyond a simple withdrawal attempt. They were setting me up for debt I had never agreed to. I knew then that the paper Marcy had pressed against my hand wasn't about the hospital. They had used my weakness. They had used my fingerprint. I stood in the living room, clutching the letter. My legs shook, but this time not from illness. This time from rage. The betrayal ran deeper than I had imagined. My son and his wife weren't just careless. They were predators, and they thought I was easy prey. I whispered to myself, not anymore. The fight inside me had been lit. I would not let them steal what Henry and I had built, what decades of sacrifice had preserved. They had mistaken my frailty for foolishness, and soon they would see the difference. The next morning, I dressed slowly, but with purpose. A wool skirt, my best cardigan, and the sturdy cane Henry had carved for me years ago. My hands still shook as I buttoned the blouse, but this time it wasn't sickness. It was fury, tightly held in check. I tucked the letters into my handbag and set out for the bank. The winter air was sharp, cutting against my cheeks as I walked up the steps. Each breath reminded me that my lungs were still healing, but I pressed forward. The bank doors opened with a hiss, and the sterile scent of polished marble and paper filled my nose. For years, this building had been a place of reassurance, of deposits carefully saved, of Henry and I planning for retirement, of safety. Now it felt like a battlefield. A young teller greeted me politely, but I asked for the branch manager. I wasn't here for small talk. Within minutes, I was ushered into a glass-walled office where Mr. Klein, the manager I had known for decades, rose from behind his desk. "Mrs. Henderson," he said warmly, though a crease furrowed his brow. "I was surprised to see your name on those forms. What brings you in?" I placed the letters on his desk. "You tell me, Mr. Klein, because I didn't authorize anything." He adjusted his glasses, carefully unfolding the papers. His eyes darted across the lines, and then he reached into a file drawer. "Perhaps we should go over the documents together." When he placed the folder in front of me, my breath caught. There it was, my fingerprint, smudged, tilted at an odd angle, pressed in ink onto forms that granted my son, Daniel, and his wife, Marcy, full authorization over my accounts. Not just to withdraw funds, but to open credit, apply for loans, and make binding decisions in my name. The room tilted for a moment, as though the sickness had returned. But it wasn't fever. It was the shock of betrayal. My hand, my fingerprint, the mark that was supposed to protect me, had been used as a weapon against me. Mr. Klein cleared his throat softly. "Mrs. Henderson, I assumed you were aware. Your son and daughter-in-law brought these forms in last month. They said you were too unwell to appear in person, but that you had consented." Tears blurred my vision, but I blinked them away. I was too unwell. They knew that. I was bedridden with pneumonia. "I don't even remember this form." He leaned forward, his voice gentler now. "Then I'm afraid you've been the victim of fraud. Family or not, this is a criminal matter." The word hung in the air. Fraud. It wasn't just a mistake, not a misunderstanding. It was theft. Theft by the very people I had raised, fed, clothed, and sacrificed for. I remembered Marcy's voice that night. "It's just a hospital release form, Clara." The softness, the reassurance. My son standing by, watching. They had both known exactly what they were doing. My pulse thundered in my ears. I thought of Henry. How proud he had been when we made our final mortgage payment. How carefully he had built the life we shared. And now, his own son was ready to gamble it all away, leaving me with nothing but debts. I straightened in my chair, gripping the cane tighter. "Mr. Klein, what can be done?" He tapped the papers with his pen. "We can freeze the authorizations immediately, but I recommend you involve an attorney. This is larger than the bank. It's a matter of protecting your assets, and frankly, yourself." Protecting myself. I had never thought I'd need to protect myself from Daniel, from Marcy, from my own family. But here I was, sitting under the cold light of the bank's office, staring at the evidence. I thanked Mr. Klein, collected the documents, and stepped back into the brisk air. My legs felt heavy, but my spirit burned with clarity. The betrayal was undeniable now. They had used my fingerprint while I was too weak to resist. They had gambled on my silence. As I walked home, I whispered aloud, "You wanted my silence, but you're going to hear my voice." It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about dignity, about justice, about reminding them that even at 74, I was not a pawn to be played with. The walk back from the bank was heavier than I expected. Each step seemed to echo with the weight of what I'd seen. The smudged fingerprint, the legal wording, my son's name typed neatly beside Marcy's. By the time I reached my front porch, I wasn't just tired, I was hollow. But somewhere beneath that hollow space, something else stirred. Resolve. I didn't storm into Daniel's house. I didn't call Marcy and demand answers. That would have been exactly what they expected. A mother's outrage, hot and loud, easy to dismiss as emotion. No. If they wanted to treat me like a fool, then I would answer as something they hadn't considered. A strategist. That night, I pulled out Henry's old address book. My husband had been many things: a machinist, a father, a man of steady principles, but he also believed in being prepared. He had insisted we keep the number of a lawyer we trusted, just in case. For years, I never thought I'd need it. But as I traced my finger over the faded ink of Mr. Weller's name, I felt Henry's foresight, like a hand on my shoulder. The next morning, I dialed the number. Mr. Weller answered himself, his voice gravelly but warm. I explained who I was, reminded him that he had once helped Henry settle a property matter. There was a pause, and then he said, "Clara, I remember. Why don't you come by this afternoon?" When I arrived at his office, tucked above the pharmacy downtown, I carried the documents in a folder hugged close to my chest. His office smelled faintly of paper and coffee, the walls lined with law books that looked older than me. He listened quietly as I laid out everything: the illness, the fingerprint, the bank letters, the phone calls. When I slid the authorization forms across his desk, he frowned. "This is fraud, plain and simple. They took advantage of your incapacity. Even if you had signed willingly, any contract made under duress or illness can be challenged. But the fingerprint, that's damning evidence." I swallowed hard. "What can be done?" He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "First, we secure your accounts. I'll draft a notice to the bank, instructing them to freeze any actions tied to these documents. Second, we gather proof. You'll need copies of everything: statements, surveillance if possible, any correspondence. Third," his eyes softened, "we decide whether you want this pursued criminally. Because, Clara, this isn't just a family dispute. This is a felony." The word hung heavy between us. Felony. To think my own son might face that label. A part of me wanted to recoil, to say, "No, he's still my boy." But another part of me, the part that had sat trembling in the bank office, knew this was no longer about sparing his pride. This was about survival. I nodded slowly. "Do what you must." Mr. Weller gave a firm nod, then picked up the phone to call the bank directly. I listened as he spoke in clipped, professional tones, instructing them to honor only my direct authorization moving forward. When he hung up, he slid the folder back to me. "Clara, keep these safe. And from this moment forward, don't sign or press your hand to anything unless I review it first. Understood?" "Yes," I whispered. When I stepped back into the chilly air, the world felt different. I wasn't powerless anymore. I had a plan, an ally, and the law on my side. The betrayal still cut deep, but now it was tempered by a strange sense of strength I hadn't felt in years. That evening, I sat in my armchair and thought of Daniel as a little boy. The freckles across his nose, the way he used to run to me after school with stories tumbling out of his mouth. How had that boy grown into a man who would press his mother's hand onto fraudulent papers? Tears slipped down my cheeks, but I let them fall. Mourning wasn't just for the dead. It was for the living who had chosen to kill the bond you thought was unbreakable. But as I wiped my face, I whispered aloud, "You thought I'd be too weak to fight. You've forgotten who I am." And for the first time since my illness, I felt something like peace. Not because things were fixed, but because I finally had the courage to see them through. For a few days after meeting Mr. Weller, I kept my routine steady. I tended to the flowers, read my books, and drank my morning tea as though nothing at all was wrong. Outwardly, I was the same Clara Henderson they thought they knew. Frail, predictable, docile. Inwardly, however, I was sharpening my silence like a blade. I decided to invite Daniel and Marcy over one Saturday afternoon. The air was cool but clear, sunlight stretching across my porch as I set out the good china and a plate of oatmeal cookies. I had baked them deliberately, knowing Daniel still loved them, part of me clinging to a memory of the boy he once was, part of me wanting to watch whether guilt would choke him when he bit into his childhood favorite. They arrived together, Marcy's perfume clouding the air before she even stepped through the door. Daniel kissed my cheek perfunctorily, his eyes already scanning the room as if to make sure nothing had changed. I gestured toward the living room, smiling gently, though every muscle in me wanted to shout. We sat with our cups, the tea steaming between us. I let them speak first. Marcy chatted about sales at the furniture store where she worked, about how expensive school supplies had gotten for Alex, their son. Daniel nodded occasionally, but his eyes avoided mine. He looked tired, or perhaps wary. So, I said lightly, stirring my tea, how are you managing with bills these days? Marcy's spoon clinked against her cup as she laughed, too quickly. Oh, we're fine. Just fine. Daniel cleared his throat. We're managing, Mum. Don't worry yourself. Their answers were rehearsed, shallow. I leaned back, tilting my head. That's good to hear. The world's gotten so expensive. Sometimes I wonder how young families make it work without help. The silence that followed was sharp. Marcy looked down, her painted nails tracing the rim of her cup. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I could almost hear their thoughts. Does she know? Did the bank tell her? I didn't let the silence last too long. I patted my knee, as if remembering something simple. Speaking of finances, I have an appointment at the bank tomorrow. Routine business, I was thinking, perhaps you two could come with me? I might need a little help with the walking, and the manager always likes to see family faces. Marcy's head snapped up, her smile frozen. The bank? Tomorrow? Yes, I said softly, sipping my tea. 10 o'clock sharp. It would mean a lot if you joined me. Daniel's jaw tightened. He tried to recover quickly, forcing a smile. Of course, Mom. If you need us, we'll be there. I watched them exchange a glance, quick, uneasy, full of questions neither dared voice. They thought they'd played me. They thought they were still in control. But tomorrow, the mask would drop. As they rose to leave, I pressed a bag of cookies into Daniel's hand. Take these home for Alex, I said warmly. Tell him Grandma loves him. For a moment, Daniel hesitated, his eyes flickering with something. Was it guilt or fear? He murmured a quiet thank you and turned away. When the door closed behind them, I leaned against the frame, my breath shuddering out. Tomorrow would not just be another errand. Tomorrow, I would walk into the bank not as a victim, but as a woman prepared to reclaim her dignity. And I would not be alone. Mr. Weller would be waiting, briefcase in hand, the law on my side. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, listening to the quiet creak of the house around me, Henry's old photograph on the nightstand catching the moonlight. I whispered to it like a prayer. Tomorrow, love. Tomorrow they'll see. Morning came, crisp and clear. I rose earlier than usual, dressed in my navy coat, and fastened the silver brooch Henry had given me on our 25th anniversary. It felt like armor, a reminder of the man who had built a life with me, brick by brick. Today wasn't just about money. It was about protecting what he and I had worked for, and about showing our son that betrayal had a price. Mr. Weller was already waiting when I arrived at the bank. He stood outside, his briefcase tucked under one arm, his overcoat buttoned against the chill. He gave me a respectful nod. Morning, Clara. Are you ready? I tightened my grip on the cane. More than ready. Daniel and Marcy arrived minutes later, their steps quick, their eyes flicking nervously between me and Mr. Weller. Marcy's smile was brittle, her lipstick brighter than usual, as though painting confidence onto her face. Daniel muttered a greeting, his jaw tense. Inside, the branch manager, Mr. Klein, guided us into the same glass-walled office where I had first seen the forged documents. Papers were spread, neatly across his desk. Sunlight streamed in, catching the dust motes in the air, giving the whole scene a courtroom-like gravity. Mr. Weller placed his briefcase on the desk, clicked it open, and laid out the folder of evidence. His voice was calm, professional. Mrs. Henderson has brought to my attention documents filed here under fraudulent pretenses. We're here to address this formally, with the bank's cooperation. Marcy shifted in her chair. Fraudulent? That's absurd. Clara, tell them we were just trying to help while you were sick. I met her eyes, steady and unflinching. Help doesn't involve pressing a dying woman's hand onto papers she doesn't understand. Daniel's face flushed red. Mum, that's not fair. You agreed. I cut him off, my voice quiet but sharp enough to pierce the air. I was delirious with fever, Daniel. I barely knew my own name. And you took that moment to steal from me. Mr. Klein cleared his throat and pushed the forms toward Daniel and Marcy. These authorizations are invalid. Effective immediately, your access to Mrs. Henderson's accounts is terminated. Further, this matter will be documented for potential legal action. Mr. Weller added, if Mrs. Henderson chooses, charges can and will be filed. Fingerprint forgery and financial fraud carry serious consequences. Prison time in some cases. The color drained from Marcy's face. She glanced at Daniel, whose fists clenched on the table. He looked like a boy again, cornered and furious, but with nowhere to run. You'll regret this, Daniel hissed at me, his voice low, his eyes blazing with something between anger and desperation. I straightened, my cane steady at my side. No, Daniel. You will. You thought my silence meant weakness. But I see you now. I see exactly who you are. The office was silent, except for the hum of the heater. Outside, customers and tellers went about their business. But inside that glass room, my family was unraveling. The son I had raised, the daughter-in-law I had welcomed, both caught in the web of their own greed. Mr. Weller gathered the papers, sliding them back into his briefcase with measured calm. Mrs. Henderson, your accounts are secure. I'll follow up this afternoon with the next steps. I nodded, though my eyes never left Daniel's. For years, I had looked at him and seen my child, my pride. Now I saw something else entirely, a man who had gambled his soul for money and lost. When the meeting ended, Marcy rushed out first, her heels clicking against the tile, her face pale. Daniel lingered, his chest heaving as though words fought to escape him. But he found none. At last, he turned on his heel and stalked out. I remained in the chair a moment longer, my breath steadying. Mr. Klein offered me a kind smile. You've done the right thing, Mrs. Henderson, perhaps. But as I walked out with Mr. Weller at my side, I knew this was only the beginning. The bank had closed its doors to them, but their desperation had only just begun to surface. And desperation makes people reckless. That night, as I set my cane by the bed, I wondered what tomorrow would bring. I didn't have to wonder long, because at dawn, the knocking began. The knocking came before the sun had fully risen, sharp and urgent against the wooden door. I had just settled with my morning tea when it began, rattling the quiet of the house. At first I thought it must be the postman or a neighbour in distress. But as the pounding grew louder, more desperate, I knew. When I opened the door, Daniel stood there, his face haggard, Marcy just behind him with eyes swollen from crying. The proud confidence they carried into my home days ago was gone, stripped away like paint in the rain. "Mom," Daniel began, his voice cracking. "Please, we need to talk." Marcy stepped forward, clutching her coat tighter around her. "Clara, we didn't mean for it to go this far. Please, you can fix this. Just call the bank, call the lawyer. Tell them you don't want to press charges." I looked at them both, their faces pale and drawn, and felt a wave of bitter recognition. They weren't here because they loved me. They weren't here out of guilt. They were here because they were cornered. I let the silence stretch, leaning on my cane, watching their discomfort deepen. Finally, I said quietly, "So now you remember where I live?" Daniel flinched. "Mom, don't do this. We're family. You can't treat us like criminals." "Family?" My voice rose, trembling not with weakness, but with fury held too long. Family doesn't press a sick woman's hand onto bank papers. Family doesn't steal fingerprints in the night. Family doesn't gamble away trust built over a lifetime. Marcy's tears spilled over, her hands shaking. "We were drowning, Clara. The bills, The mortgage, Alex's tuition. What were we supposed to do? We thought you'd understand. We thought, you thought I wouldn't fight back. I cut in. You thought I was too old, too frail, too dependent on you to notice. Daniel's voice turned sharper, desperate. We didn't mean to hurt you. Just help us make it right. Please, don't let this ruin everything. I steadied myself, my heart aching but my resolve like iron. You ruined everything when you chose greed over love. I gave you life, Daniel. I raised you with stories, with food I sometimes went without to put on your plate. I stayed up nights sewing patches on your jeans so you wouldn't be teased at school. I sacrificed so you could stand tall. And now, you would rather see me in debt, broken, humiliated, than face your own failures. He lowered his head, his shoulders slumping. For the first time, I saw the weight of shame crack his mask. But shame was not repentance. Shame was fear of consequence. Marcy reached for my hand, her grip trembling. Please, Clara, think of Alex. If his father goes to jail, if we lose everything. I pulled my hand back, cold and steady. Alex deserves better than parents who teach him that betrayal is a solution. The wind gusted through the doorway, chilling the room. Daniel looked up, his eyes glassy. So that's it? You're choosing the law over your own blood? I drew myself up, as tall as my bones would allow. I'm choosing respect. I'm choosing dignity. I'm choosing to live without fear in my own home. The silence between us was thick, broken only by Marcy's muffled sobs. Daniel clenched his jaw, but he had no more words. At last, I placed my hand on the door. Leave, I said firmly. Go. Until you understand what it means to be family, this door stays closed. And with that, I shut them out. Their muffled pleas seeped through the wood for a moment longer, but I did not open it again. I turned back to the quiet of my home, my cane steady on the floorboards. For the first time in weeks, I felt safe, not because the danger was gone, but because I had chosen myself. After Daniel and Marcy left that morning, their pleas fading down the walkway, I closed every curtain in the house and sat quietly at my kitchen table. The teacup beside me had gone cold, untouched, but I didn't mind. For the first time in weeks, the silence felt like my own again, unbroken, untainted by whispers of fraud or betrayal. That afternoon, I called Mr. Weller. My voice didn't shake as I told him what had happened at my doorstep. They begged me to stop, I said. And what did you say? He asked. I let out a breath, calm but firm. I told them family doesn't steal fingerprints. And then I closed the door. There was a pause on the line before he said softly, Then you've already won the hardest battle. The days that followed were filled with paperwork, signatures, and legal precautions. Mr. Weller drafted new protections for my accounts, ensuring no one could ever access them without my direct presence. The bank, under Mr. Klein's supervision, added additional safeguards, noting in my file that my son and daughter-in-law had attempted fraudulent activity. It felt strange, needing protection from the very people who should have been protecting me. But strange or not, it was necessary. One evening, as I sat by the fireplace with Henry's photo beside me, I began rewriting my will. The pen felt heavy in my hand, but my resolve guided it steadily across the page. Daniel and Marcy's names, once included without hesitation, were struck out. Their betrayal had earned them nothing but absence. Instead, I redirected what little wealth I had toward Alex's future, on the condition that it bypass his parents entirely until he was grown enough to understand the meaning of responsibility. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about ensuring the cycle of greed and betrayal didn't continue unchecked. In the quiet, I found myself reflecting on the journey. Illness had left me weak, bedridden, dependent. I had trusted my family to care for me in that fragile state. Instead, they saw an opportunity. They looked at me not as a mother, not as a woman who had built a life from nothing, but as a signature, a fingerprint, a means to an end. That betrayal had broken something inside me, but it had also built something new, a sharper spine, a clearer voice, a strength I hadn't realized still lived in me. The neighbors noticed the change. "You're walking taller these days, Clara," Mrs. Jennings remarked one morning as I collected the mail. I only smiled. If only she knew the battles fought behind these curtains. Daniel hasn't come back since that morning of knocking and begging. Marcy sent a single letter, tear-stained and apologetic, but I couldn't bring myself to read past the first few lines. Words, after all, are cheap when actions have already spoken louder. And yet, I don't sit here bitter. I sit here free. Free from fear that my savings could vanish in the night. Free from the illusion that blood alone defines loyalty. Free from the weight of silence I once carried like a burden. Some evenings, I light a candle by Henry's photograph and speak aloud, as though he's listening from just beyond the veil. They thought I was too weak, love. They thought I'd fold. But I stood up. In those moments, I swear the house feels warmer, steadier, as though he's nodding in approval. Illness may weaken the body, but betrayal, it hardens the spirit. And in the quiet after the storm, I discovered something I had forgotten, that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the steady closing of a door, the refusal to yield, the quiet dignity of a woman who chooses herself. So when they came begging, I realized I didn't need their apologies. I didn't need their excuses. I already had my justice. And justice, I've learned, is the greatest inheritance